All right. Hello, everyone. So, welcome to the first presentation on bones. So, we kind of covered the preliminaries earlier in the first presentation. We went over the structure of bone and the different types of bones. And now we're going to get into the identification of bones. But before we do that, I've got a couple of things I want to point out to you. First of all, I'm often asked what is a good supplement, if you will, or a good atlas of human anatomy. And my recommendation is always this particular textbook. It's a little bit on the expensive side, but it's the best that I have seen out there in terms of the description and the drawings for human anatomy. So it's called Atlas of Human Anatomy, and the author is Frank H. Netter. He has since passed away, but he is a doctor, obviously, and also an excellent artist. And actually, there's a nice picture of him here. Let's see. Yeah, that's him right there. So that's him in his studio. And so the work that he does is exceptional. As I said, best atlas of human anatomy I've ever run into. And there are many med schools that actually require this as part of their textbooks. We will be seeing some of his images as we go through and identify bones. In fact, why don't I just go ahead and show you a typical example of his artwork. So this is a picture, obviously, of the ear and the structure of the ear, including the outer, the middle, and the inner ear. You can see very detailed drawings, very accurate, and just a wonderful, wonderful resource if you're looking for something to supplement your education as you go forward. This I highly, highly recommend this as a source of information. So I have actually bought two copies because one of those copies I wanted to take apart in order to use the images, and the other one I've kept in whole. So let's begin the discovery of the human skeletal system. And this is an image showing you the two basic parts of the skeletal system. Now, we've organized the bones once by their shape and their structure. There is a second way in which to look at the skeletal system, and what you're looking at is a representation of that second way. So you'll notice that in the center here we have, in blue, a set of bones here from the posterior view, and then we have these structures, the limbs, attached to that center core. And that's the way you're designed. So you're designed, the skeletal system, I should say, is designed, the center core, and then you hang the limbs off that center core, as you see there. So this center core is the axial skeletal system, and that's what we're going to be covering first. And in this lecture, I'm going to be covering just this part, the skull, the bones of the skull and the landmarks of the skull. And then in the second presentation, I will do the rest of this. So that would be the vertebral column, the rib cage, the sternum, and the sacrum. And then in following presentations, I'll do the upper limb and then the lower limb. So that's, as I see it, how we're going to break these presentations down. So you have the center core, the axial skeletal system, and then off of that you hang the limbs. And that's how your skeletal system is designed. There's a couple things I'd go ahead and like to point out to you. So let me zoom in so you can see this a little bit better. So the upper limbs, the structure of the upper limbs is both similar and different than the lower limbs. So let's take a look at some similarities. Here, one bone. Here, one bone. Here, two bones. Here, two bones. And then here we have a set of smaller bones that make up the wrist, and then the hand. Same sort of structure here. We have a set of smaller bones that make up the ankle, and then the foot. So lots of similarities in the structure of the limbs, but there are also differences. So for example, if you look carefully here, the upper girdle, that is the upper limbs, how they're attached to the center core of your body, is very different than the way these are connected. So if you look carefully, let's zoom in, you will notice that this limb is completely separate from that limb. There is no connection between this arm and that arm. So these are independent units that we're attaching to the core of our body. And notice that this joint is a ball and socket joint, but it's quite open, and we'll look at that again. Take a look at what's happening down here. We have a complete circle of bones making up the girdle here, and then that socket joint is an enclosed socket joint. So what's happening here is that up here we're emphasizing flexibility, and down here we're emphasizing strength. Up here, the upper limbs is what we manipulate the world with. And so all of these structures are designed, when you look at them closely, to enhance the flexibility and the movement of the upper limbs. What we're looking for down here in the lower limbs is strength. We're carrying the weight of our body through the world. We're moving through the world with this structure. And so what we emphasize down here is strength and stability as opposed to flexibility up here. So clearly one bone here, but this is a much larger bone than this bone right here. And there are many other differences between the two systems, which we'll talk about as we get closer. I just wanted to point that out to you now, since we had the entire skeletal system here in this image, and I'll come back to that idea in just a bit. So that's the basic structural, or the basic skeletal system and how it's put together, sort of the design of the system. At this point, you want to make sure that you have this handout, lab handout, bone worksheet, axial skeleton. It is in Canvas. If you don't have it with you right now, go ahead and put me on pause, go back into Canvas and download this. I think you'll need the first 13 sheets or so for this presentation that we're doing right here. If you want to download the whole thing, fine, do that. But you need to have this worksheet. I'll be using that worksheet as we go through and look at the bones. So this is basically the same picture we just looked at, okay? And then I can take that same skeletal system and break it down a little bit more, and we can talk about, and what we're going to look at and focus on in today's lecture is the skull. So 8 bones of the cranium and 14 facial bones. We will not cover all 14 facial bones. We'll take a look at the hyoid bone, the so-called auditory ossicles, in which there are a total of 6, 3 in each ear. And then in the second presentation, I'm going to cover these bones, the vertebral column, the sternum, and the ribs, and that will finish up the axial skeleton. Then, in further presentations, I will do the pectoral girdle and the upper limbs. That would be a presentation. And then another presentation, pelvic girdle, and the lower limbs. So I'm often asked, do I need to memorize these numbers? And my answer is no, with a couple of minor exceptions. So one of the things that I want you to realize is that there's a difference in the number of bones that we see in the ankle and in the wrist. So the ankle and the wrist are homologous structures. And if we look at, for example, the carpal bones, there are 16 of them. There's 8 bones in each wrist. Okay? So 8 bones in each wrist. If we go back we go and look at the foot, the tarsal bones, there are 7 in each foot. So there's a difference, 8 and 7. They're homologous structures. They are in the same relative locations. They're performing the same function. So the tarsal bones are in the same location as the carpal bones are relative to the upper limb. Okay? And they're doing the same thing. Why are there only 7 here, and why are there a total of 8 here? So again, the reason is up here we're looking for flexibility. With 8 bones, I get more flexible wrist. I get a more flexible wrist. With 7 bones, I get a stronger ankle. So what you're getting is a trade-off once again between flexibility and um, and strength and stability. So those bones, those numbers, I do want you to memorize because it goes to the point that I'm making about the difference between the flexibility up here and the stability down here. But the rest of the numbers, if you want to know those numbers, you can just simply look them up someplace. So let's come back. I'm going to take care of the auditory ossicles and the hyoid bone, and we're just going to get those out of the way right now, and then we'll focus on these bones up here, the 8 bones of the cranium, and not all, but most of the facial bones. So we will begin with the auditory ossicles, and just so happens, I do have an example of those bones here. So I'm going to zoom in so we can see those very clearly. Okay, so those are the bones that we call the auditory ossicles. And let me just give you a sense of how large or small they are. So I'm going to take a pen, and this is the end of the pen, and look at that. So this is a typical pen, and I'm going to show you how small those bones are. Okay, so we have the malleus, or the malleus, excuse me, the incus, and the stapes. Those 3 bones are found, these set of bones, one are found, one set in each ear. So these small bones, collectively, all 6 of them, are called the auditory ossicles. Now, what is it that they do? What is their purpose? Well, let's go back and look at a nice little image such as this one right here. And let's scoot in a little bit so we can see the details. Now this, as I said, is from Netter's book. So here's my outer ear. And then there's my eardrum. And then I have a space right here. That's called the middle ear. And you see that Eustachian tube? That tube we've talked about. That tube is composed of elastic cartilage, just like your ear. And we had talked about that when we were looking at connective tissue, and particularly cartilage. So this connects this part of the ear with the throat. So this is your throat, and this is how you equalize pressure between the outside of the eardrum and the inside of the eardrum, because you want the pressure of the air equal on both sides of that eardrum. So what happens is, when you disturb the air, you produce air waves, or compressional waves of atmosphere, and they enter into the canal here, and they press against the eardrum, and they cause that eardrum to vibrate. That vibration is picked up by the 3 bones that we call the auditory ossicles. So they are a way to enhance and to magnify the movement of the eardrum. So it doesn't take a great deal of movement of the eardrum to produce a lot of movement right here, because you get this mechanical advantage by the way these bones are arranged. Okay. Now at the end, the stapes is connected to a tube, and in that tube is a fluid. And so when this stapes moves back and forth, the membrane that it's connected to right here is also moving back and forth. Okay. And the fluid inside this structure then is moving. Kind of like when you sit in your bathtub and you push your body back and forth in the bathtub and you create waves of water like that. Well, the same things happen here. As this moves back and forth, it applies pressure to the water, or the fluid. It's not water, it's a fluid. Mostly composed of water, but other things are in it too. And that fluid moves back and forth. And then there are little tiny hairs that are sticking up, if you can just make them out right there. Little tiny hairs. And as the fluid moves back and forth across those hairs bend. Those hairs are connected to the nervous system, and you're going to transmit electrical signals into the brain through the vestibular cochlear nerve, which is exiting here in the internal acoustic meatus. And we'll talk about that structure later on. So you're taking mechanical movement here, And through these series of mechanisms, you're turning that mechanical movement into an electrical impulse, which enters the brain, and that's what you're interpreting as sound, right? And these auditory ossicles are involved in that process. Okay, so those are the auditory ossicles. Now, there is the hyoid bone. And the hyoid bone is sitting here. This is another drawing from Netter. There it is. That's the hyoid bone right there. And as you can see, it's just underneath the jaw and just above the blah, 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 larynx. Okay. So there is connective tissue that they're not showing in this drawing that connects the larynx to the bottom edge of the hyoid bone, and then the tongue, which is sitting here in the mouth, extends down and back and anchors itself to the top of this bone. So on the top of this bone we anchor the tongue, and on the underside of this bone we're going to anchor the larynx. So it sits between that tongue and the voice box. It is completely surrounded by soft tissue. This is the only bone in your body which is not connected to another bone. Okay? It's the only bone in the human body which is not articulating with another bone. It sits by itself in soft tissue. And what it does is it anchors the tongue and hangs the larynx from the bottom of it. A little fun fact. So when they find someone who's dead and they suspect foul play, if they are suspecting strangulation, for example, they're going to take a look at this bone because often this bone is fractured when you strangle somebody. Okay. So that's the hyoid bone. All right. Well, let's begin and take a look at the skull. And so you should have this sheet in front of you. This is the lab study guide. We're starting right here with the skull. We'll go through the cranial bones, and we'll do the frontal bone, and then we'll look at the coronal suture, and then the parietal bone, and then we'll move from the parietal bone. We'll talk about the sagittal suture and the lambdoid suture, and then we'll continue with the occipital bone. All right, so let's begin with the image of the frontal bone. So this is from your textbook, and it's in blue. You can see this whole entire region right here in blue is the frontal bone. And you should also have, now we're going to do this, start off with this image. Okay, so this is from the worksheet. Let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and label that. So that is my frontal bone. Okay, one of the things I want you to notice in terms of the structure of the frontal bone is that part of that frontal bone extends backwards in the eye socket to create the roof of the eye socket. So this is obviously where your eye is sitting, but the roof of that bony structure is composed of the frontal bone. So here's Netter's image of that same thing. Again, choosing blue to identify the frontal bone. You can see again that it is also part of the roof of the orbit of the eye. Okay. So frontal bone. Next, then, is the coronal suture. So we've heard this term coronal before. Coronal, we said it in terms of coronal sectioning, or and if we have a visual picture from the top, we can see that clearly. So this is again Netter, and as you can see, there is a suture. So this is in blue again, the frontal bone, and then the two bones behind it, which we'll talk about, are the parietal bones. And this suture that you see here is called the coronal suture. And notice that we have this jagged edge to that suture. It's not a clean, straight edge. It's jagged. Same applies here. Why is that? To increase surface area. So the bonding between the frontal bone and the two bones behind it, the parietal bones, is a stronger connection if we have this jagged edge rather than a clean, flat edge connecting those two bones. So that's the coronal suture. Okay. And I believe we'll have a picture of that. We do. We have a couple of different pictures. So here, that is my coronal suture. There. This is page 5 of that handout if you're looking. And I actually can show you a different, this is page 4. And if you look very carefully right here, I also have the coronal suture. Okay. All right. Next on our list is the parietal bones. So we're going to do the parietal bones next, and that's very easily seen in two different views here. From the top, this is a superior view, I have the two parietal bones. Okay, that's one view. I also have a lateral view, which we can see right here. There is the parietal bones. There's my coronal suture. Okay. Let's see if I have from your textbook. Indeed, same thing. Coronal suture here, frontal bone, parietal bone. Now I'm going to show you an actual skull in just a moment. So I'm just covering these structures. I'm going to cover the major cranial bones, and then I'll turn to the skull and I'll show you the same thing over again. So we'll see it many different times. So I've got the frontal bone, the parietal bone, and if I look carefully at the top, again, looking at the superior view, I have a suture right down the center, and that's my sagittal suture. We've heard that word sagittal before when we talked about mid-sagittal and parasagittal. So there it is. That's the sagittal suture. That connects the two parietal bones along the top of superior surface of the head. So let's see. Go ahead and identify those on our drawings. Let's see if we... okay. So page 6, we have this drawing right here. So that is my sagittal suture. This is my parietal bone. And that is my frontal bone. And this is my coronal suture. Well, I have all of them in one single location. Okay. Oakley dokleys. Let's take a look at the next structure on the list. And that is going to be the lambdoid. The lambdoid suture. Now here we're going to look at a posterior view. And that will show us the lambdoid suture very clearly. I find the posterior view. There it is. So here we have a suture that goes all the way up and around. That is my lambdoid suture. This suture right here. And I'm going to go ahead and look for Mr. Netter's drawing of the same thing. I'm sure I have it. And maybe I don't. I thought I did. Doesn't matter if I don't. You have seen it. And that's what's important. Yeah, I don't have a posterior view. Okay. So, nevertheless, you can see it there. That's my lambdoid suture. Let's go ahead and find it in our drawings. And I'm going to say, page 7, page 8. Yeah. So, a little bit hard to see, but it is there. So I'm looking at page 10 now of the handout. And as I said, very difficult to see, but if I trace it, it is basically like that. So this is going to be my lambdoid suture. Okay. Lambdoid suture. Okay. Okay. Let's move on. And I want to now, we've got enough material so I can turn to the skull and review what we've just looked at using the skull. And let's grab our skull. Pan out. So here we are in the front. It's my frontal bone right here. And as you noticed in the picture, this portion is part of the frontal bone. Okay, so all of that is frontal bone. Then I have my two parietal bones. And then back here, I have the lambdoid suture. I have the sagittal suture, and then I have my coronal suture. All right. The next bone we're going to take a look at, and since I'm holding the skull, I'll go ahead and show you that bone, is the occipital bone, and that's posterior. So that's behind the skull. And all of this is the occipital bone, and that occipital bone extends down to and includes all of this as well. So that's my occipital bone. And there's a number of structures on the occipital bone that we're going to identify. So we're going to look for the occipital condyles. There's a pair of them right here, one there. Notice that smooth surface. What did we say about smooth surfaces? When we see a smooth surface like this, it indicates that that surface is covered with hyaline cartilage, articulating cartilage. And so this is a connection between one bone, in this case the occipital bone, and another bone, which would be C1, the first vertebral, the first cervical vertebra. And that gives you the connection between the head and the vertebral column. So then we have this very large hole right here. That's foramen magnum. Okay. And then we also have the external occipital protuberance. And if we look closely right here, there's a little lump of bone. And if you reach behind your head, you'll find that right about here, there's a little lumpy part of your skull right there. And what you're touching when you touch that is this, which is the occipital protuberance. So there's a set of muscles that are attached here and that extend down into the back. We'll talk about those muscles, of course, later on. Okay, so that's the occipital bone. And let's take a look at this. So we're going to take a look at the occipital bone, and I want you to notice that we've got our first structure that has a function. Number one here, there's our second one, and then this one right here. Okay, so we're going to look at, come back in, there you go. We're going to take a look at the occipital condyle. Its function is it's an articulation with C1 and the first vertebral vertebrae. In other words, the occipital condyle articulates with C1, which is the first vertebral vertebrae. We looked at, and we'll look at it again in a series of drawings, the foramen magnum. Its function is the opening for the spinal cord. Okay. And we'll also look at, or we did, but we'll look at it in pictures again, the external occipital protuberance, which is the attachment of a large elastic ligament that supports the head. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at our pictures. Here's one. There's the external occipital protuberance. Okay. There is my occipital bone. Okay. And let's see if we can find that. So coming back to page 10. Right here, that is my occipital protuberance. It's out of the way. So this is my external occipital protuberance. But that's not all. We also have this view. So now we're on the inferior surface of the skull. And again, in orange is the occipital bone. There is the external occipital protuberance. As you see, it extends down and creates the bottom platform of the skull. And it has this very large opening. That's the foramen magnum. And then on either side are the occipital condyles, right there. So, if we have the proper drawing or picture in front of us, let's go ahead and take a look at page 8. Page 8 of the handout. So, right here is the occipital condyle. This opening, the hole, is the foramen magnum. And you've already been introduced to the terminology here. We've talked about what a condyle is. So this is the condyle on the occipital bone. That's the name is telling you that. Okay. We also know what a foramen is. And so this is a large foramen or large hole. Okay. And then we also have at the same time the external occipital protuberance. Okay. All of it there in one single picture. All right. So keep these functions in mind because I will test you on the functions of those structures. All right, so that's the occipital bone. What's the next bone on our agenda? The next bone is the temporal bone. So let's take a look at what we need to know. So the temporal bone again, two bones, just as the occipital bone was a single bone. So one bone, back of the skull. Okay. So the temporal bone has two bones, one on either side, and it contains the external auditory meatus, and its function is the opening to the middle ear, sound waves to pass. The internal auditory meatus, which is the opening for the facial nerve and the vestibulocochlear nerve. So there are 12 cranial nerves, and they're numbered using Roman numerals. So this is the 7th and 8th cranial nerve. The mandibular fossa, which is our articulation point for the mandible. And let's see if this continues. Oh. Okay. There's quite a bit happening on the temporal bone. There's the mastoid process, which is the insertion of the sternocleidoid mastoid muscle. So when you see this dark highlighted function, that's telling you that you're going to be seeing that when you look at muscles. So we will see this structure again when we look at the sternocleidoid mastoid muscle. It's the insertion for that muscle. So pay special attention to those functions which are highlighted in black. Okay. Then we'll have the carotid foramen or canal, which is the opening for the carotid artery. The jugular foramen, which is the opening for the jugular vein. And the zygomatic arch, which is for muscle attachment. All of those things are going to be in this next bone that we study, which is the temporal bone. Okay. So let's grab a couple of pictures now and take a look at that. We've got a couple of really good views. Lateral view is good. Let's start off with our friend Netter. And we can see, okay, so I have here this, what is that? I don't know what color that is. Chartreuse? I don't know. Rose color. Let's call that rose color. So that's the temporal bone. Here is the external, and he's calling it acoustic. We are calling it something down. We're calling it the external auditory meatus. He calls it acoustic. So sometimes you'll see this slight difference in terminology in between different textbooks. So it doesn't matter. It's the same. Acoustic, auditory means the same thing. External auditory meatus, external acoustic meatus. I would prefer that you use external auditory meatus, but if you people should know what you mean if you're using acoustic. So that's this opening right here. And we already know what a meatus is, do we not? Yes, we do. All right, so that's the structure. Then here is this is the zygomatic, they call it zygomatic process, but this entire thing is the zygomatic arch, and it's composed of two bones, the temporal bone and the zygomatic bone. And we'll take a look at that in just a second. Okay, so let's come back and look at this. Now, this is from your textbook. So this is a nice view of the zygomatic arch, and as you can see, this is in this, he's using purple here. Your textbook uses purple. That's this purple part is the temporal bone, and the orange part is the zygomatic bone, and between the two they create this arch, and that arch is a place for muscle attachment. Here's the external auditory meatus. We talked about that, and then over here you can see the carotid foramen and the jugular foramen. So they're two openings next to each other. And I'll show you that on the skull in just a bit. Now, the internal auditory meatus is a little more difficult to see. And to be honest with you, I don't really have a good image of this in any of the textbooks. Well, I take that back. I see there is this. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that. Here we go. It's not the best, but this, again, this purple is the temporal bone. Here's the interior view. So your brain is sitting inside here. And there's a ridge right here. And you can just barely make out a little opening right here. And this is the internal auditory meatus. And that opening is right there. Okay. So let's go ahead and mark up our drawings with those things in mind. And let's see if I can find, here we go. Let's come back to this one right here. This is not bad. Okay. And I'm going to start using some colors to indicate things. So this is going to be in yellow here. Okay. And let's go ahead and highlight this one in blue. Okay. So let's do those two. So this one here in blue is going to be it's going to be the carotid foramen. And in yellow here is going to be the jugular foramen. This is page 8, by the way. And I don't really have a good view from this angle of the external auditory meatus, so we're going to turn to a different image for that. Okay, so carotid and the foramen, the carotid and jugular foramen. And the best image actually is going to be on page 10. Let's do that, page 10. And we'll do this in green here. And so that's my external auditory meatus. This is page 10 of the handout. Okay. Let's see if I have another image that will be helpful for us here for that structure. I know that I do. It's just a matter of finding it. Here we go. Yeah. There we go. Okay. So what we just highlighted was that structure right there, external auditory meatus. And now the last structure is this. This is the mastoid process, and it's a little bony, rough surface right here that exists just posterior and inferior to the external auditory meatus. And you can see that right here. And let's see if I have a good image of that. Let's see if I can find, yes. All right, so I'm going to, page 5. Page 5. Here we go. So I think I did this one in green. That's the external auditory meatus. And I'm going to go ahead and do this one in pink. So once again, in green, this is page 5. That's my external auditory meatus. And then this is the mastoid process. Page 5. Okay. Let's turn to a skull and see what we can find there. So coming down here then, so this is again the inferior view. Back this out a little bit. So once again, we're talking about the temporal bone. So why don't we start from the side actually, temporal bone. And you can see the sutural line. So this is my temporal bone right here. And you can see it extends out to create this arch. Creates that arch there. Okay. And this is a zygomatic arch. And then I have the external auditory meatus. And then I have the mastoid process. And then, as I turn my attention to here, I'm going to find this is the carotid foramen. And this over here is the jugular foramen. So, carotid, jugular. Okay. Let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit so you can see the details. There we go. So, sometimes this is called the carotid canal because it's actually literally a canal. I'll put my pointer in that. So that's the carotid foramen. Also, sometimes, as I said, referred to as the carotid canal. And the reason it's called that is because it's coming into the skull at an angle and creates a bit of a tunnel-like structure. And then you can see it comes out right there. Okay. And, by the way, I'll also point out the internal auditory meatus, which is right there. So that's my internal auditory meatus. And as you can see there, we've got the openings for the nerves, the two cranial nerves there. And on the other side of that is this opening. And you notice this opening, let's go back to that other drawing that I referenced in the very beginning. So perhaps this makes more sense to you now. This is my external auditory meatus, and at the end of that is the eardrum. And then we have that middle ear with the ear auditory ossicles. And then we have this bony part, and in that bony part we have these very complex structures. And then exiting that are the nerves, and that is the as the internal auditory meatus. Again, he's using the word acoustic, which is okay. And there's the vestibular cochlear nerve, and also the facial nerve. Both of those are exiting the same opening. Okay. Oakley dokleys. Well, let's move on. And the next bone that we're going to cover is the sphenoid bone. And let's take a look at that. So the sphenoid bone, we are going to find something called the optic foramen, and that's going to be the opening for the optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery. We're going to find something called the sella tertia, which is going to support the pituitary gland. So this is our sphenoid bone. All right, let's find it in our drawings. And this image is probably the best image as far as finding the entire or most of the bone. So here is, in green, the sphenoid bone. It has this butterfly appearance. It's actually a very unusual looking bone, but it has this butterfly appearance. And then, if you look carefully right here, there's a series of structures that are collectively referred to as the sella tertia. And this literally translates into Turkish saddle. And because this structure in the actual anatomy of the skull looks like a saddle, And it's right there in the center. And the pituitary gland sits right in that saddle. So it's right in the depression that's right there. So that's one view of that. Let's take another view of that. So now what we're going to do, so this is inside the skull, the one that I just showed you, inside the skull. We've opened up the top of the skull, and we're looking down. If the brain were still in place, we would not be able to see this because the brain would be sitting on top of that structure. Now we're going to look at the same bone, but now we're at the inferior view of the skull. So we're looking down at the bottom of the skull, not inside, but at the bottom of the skull. And again, in green, we can see parts of that bone. Okay, so that's the sphenoid bone. Okay. And then finally, we can have also a lateral view and find, again, in green, a little bit of the sphenoid bone out here, creating the outer surface of the skull. Okay, so that's our sphenoid bone. And then finally, to see the opening into the eye, the view that is best for that, and I'm going to find that drawing as soon as I can. All right, well, we're just going to go with this one then. Here's one. So there's a hole right there, a little bit difficult to see, but that's the optic foramen. It's more easily seen in the skull. Okay. And I did have, things are getting confused here, so bear with me. I guess I don't. Yeah, that's all right. Let's go ahead and find those structures now on a drawing. And we're going to look for an interior view. Yeah, we're getting close. There we go. I'm on page 11 of the handout. And here we are, page 11. So I'm just going to kind of roughly outline this bone. So it's going to be something like this. It's going to come across like this. Okay, it's about like that. And yeah, a little bit higher, probably, just like that. Yeah. And I'll go ahead and highlight then a couple of structures that we had to know. And so I'm going to have to remind myself what those were. There it is. All right. So the first is the saddle-like structure, which is right here. And that's going to be the sella tertia. And then I'm going to darken them in. There's a hole right here, and there's a hole right here. And those are going to be the optic foramen. The optic foramen. Okay. All right, let's turn to the skull and look at those structures. So we've opened up the inside of the skull down. We're looking down to where the brain would normally be. And as you can see, it's 3D. It's a lot easier to see this. We've got this saddle-like structure. That's the sella tertia. Okay? And then right here is a hole, an opening. And I've actually put my stick through there. And I'll put the other one through that too. Okay. So those sticks are indicating the optic foramen. Right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this around so we can see where they're coming out, and there they are. There's an opening right there. That's the optic foramen. Now sometimes students get confused because they think of this as the optic foramen, but that's not really a hole, is it? That is not a hole, but that thing, that is in fact the hole. Okay? And so that's my foramen. So don't get those two confused, because what we're looking for is that hole, and that hole comes out right there. Okay. And so that's my optic foramen. Side view. There it is right there. That's the sphenoid bone. That little part right there. Okay. All right. One more bone that is considered to be a cranial bone. And here we are. That's going to be the ethmoid bone. And we're going to find a structure called the cribriform plate, which contains the olfactory foramina. The cribriform plate. Okay. And the olfactory foramina contain the openings for olfactory nerves, or cranial nerve number 1. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at those structures in this bone. And rid of all this. It's kind of piling up here. All right. There it is. That is the ethmoid bone. And we have the cribriform plate that contain holes. Those holes are referred to as the olfactory foramina, plural. Plural form of foramen. So many holes. Cribriform plate, a plate with many holes in it. And that you see right there. Okay. And looking at the skull, and you can see it very clearly now. You can see a plate with many holes in it, and that is the top of the ethmoid bone, and that plate with all the holes in it is called the cribriform plate, and the holes collectively are referred to as the olfactory foramina. Now, you can also see this bone, although it's difficult, if you look into the interior of the eye socket, and this part, that part right there is actually the ethmoid bone. That lateral wall, basically, is the ethmoid bone. Okay. The bottom of the ethmoid bone, you can see inside the nose here, these two plates represent the bottom of that bone. So those structures are actually the nerves that pass through those openings. They begin here at the bottom, or I should say the roof of the nasal cavity. And this is your olfactory membrane. It is a mucous membrane. And what happens is you breathe in, the air comes in contact with the roof of the nasal cavity, and there are receptors that are implanted in that membrane that can bind to an amazing number of different chemicals. And as they bind, they cause the cells to send off an electrical signal, and then that electrical signal travels through these openings into the brain, and that's how you get your sense of smell. That is the way your sense of smell is produced. And by the way, I did want to show you this image. It's slightly off subject, but talked about the nose, and the nose being made up of cartilage, and there you can see those cartilage pieces that this is hyaline cartilage. So this is the wiggly part of your nose right here. Okay, let's see if we can find a good image then. And indeed we can if we come back to page 11. And we're going to do this in pink. So there is the bone. That's my ethmoid bone. So this is the ethmoid bone. With the cribriform plate. That contain the olfactory foramina. Okay, so what we've done so far is we have looked at all the cranial bones that we need to know. And I just noticed one more picture, so to re-emphasize how this structure is interfacing with the nasal cavity and the in your brain, we have this nice little picture here. This is from Netter. And this plate, that's my cribriform plate. And you can see the holes. And so this is the nasal cavity. Air comes in here, comes into contact with that surface there. That's the mucous membrane. And embedded in that mucous membrane are receptors or are cells that have receptors in their membranes. When they bind to certain chemicals, they shoot off an electrical signal. And that electrical signal then passes through those openings. And that becomes your cranial nerve number 1. And you end up smelling whatever it is that you're smelling there. So that's how that's structured. This is a point of weakness, by the way, because you can see that's a very thin plate of bone, and it is perforated with holes, and on the other side of that is literally your brain. So if you have an infection in the nasal cavity, this is something they take very, very seriously, because it is very easy for infections to penetrate through that layer of bone, through those openings, and get into the brain, and then you are in trouble. It's very difficult to fight infections in the central nervous system. And it's also an opening through which certain amoeba, and if you really want to know macabre stories, Google brain-eating amoeba, and you'll find a whole series of stories about children who have died, a lot of them, from amoeba penetrating from their nose into the brain and literally eating their brain as a source of food. And the story there, since I began it, I might as well finish it. The story there is that these children, it was a mystery for a long time, and they solved it by identifying where the species of amoeba that was attacking their brain. And it turned out that was a free-living amoeba that was found in mud sediments in rivers and ponds and lakes. But what was happening is these children were jumping and running into these ponds and lakes during summer, enjoying themselves, kicking up the sediment and getting water up into their noses. And with that water came the amoeba, and once they settled down on the olfactory membrane, they just started looking for something to eat, and they penetrated those openings, and they found that the brain was something that they could eat. So, yeah, pretty macabre, gruesome story, but that's the nature of biology. All right, let's move on. Let's do the facial bones. And we're going to do, starting with the maxilla or maxillary bones, and then we're going to do the zygomatic bone. And looks like I'm missing some. That's page 9. And then the nasal bone, the palatine bone, and the mandible. And then we do the fetal skull, and we'll be done with this presentation. Starting with the facial bones, then we'll start and look at the maxillary bones. And for that, the best view, and probably the only real view that makes any sense, is the anterior face. As soon as I find that, there we go. We'll use Netter. And we have a pair of them. So there they are. Those are the upper jaws. And of course, they house the teeth of the upper jaw. Notice that a portion of that maxillary bone comes all the way up here and actually is part of the orbit of the eye. The orbit of the eye is composed of many different bones, and one of those is the maxillary bones. So there it is right there. Now, do I have a good picture of that? And I'm sure I do. Let's see if I can find the right. Let's page 3. Let's go ahead. If you get yourself to page 3. Okay, we'll take a look at that. There it is. So here is my maxillary bone. Okay. We'll come back to keep it. We're going to use this page 3 again. The next bone that we're going to look at is the zygomatic bone, which is the cheekbone. And there it is right there. Recall that part of that bone goes back and produces the zygomatic arch. So we'll take a look at that once we get at the skull. But this is the zygomatic bone. So let's go ahead and identify that. This is my zygomatic bone. My zygomatic bone. Okay. And then we're going to look at the nasal bones. There's a pair of them, and we see them. They're very small bones right up here. Those are my nasal bones. Okay. Pair of them right there. Let's go ahead and get that into our drawing. So there it is right there. And my nasal bone. And then we also are going to talk about the palatine bone. Now, for the palatine bone, literally the best view of that is going to be an inferior view. So, and that's what I would test you on if I was asking you to identify that bone. So let's find that view, and I'll show you. Here it is. This is from your textbook. So inferior view of the skull. So this is, you can see the two maxillary bones. And this is your hard palate. The yellow and the gray make up your hard palate here. And right at the most posterior portion of the hard palate in gray, you can see the palatine bone. And that is really about the only way you're going to see that bone. It's mostly surrounded by other bones and quite well hidden within the skull. But there, at that particular place on the skull, it is quite clear. So that's your zygomatic bone. And so what we need to do is find a good image of the post-inferior view, and we do. So we're going to come back to page 8. Going back to page 8, here we are. Okay. And there they are. I'm going to go ahead and color those babies in so we can see them. There. And there's a pair of them right there. And those are going to be my palatine bones. Okay. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the mandible. And, before we do that, let's go ahead and check in with our skull and find all these bones we've just identified on the skull. Okay. So let's bring the old skull over here. And here we go. So most of the bones we identified here on the front. The lower jaw is gone. If you're wondering what's happening there, the lower jaw is gone. We'll get to that in just a bit. So we have the two maxillas, one on each side here, okay, and the part of that bone, as I mentioned, goes up, becomes part of the orbit of the eye. We have the two nasal bones right here, okay, and then we have the zygomatic bone, which you can see right here. This is a zygomatic bone. As I mentioned, it comes back and makes part of that arch, the zygomatic arch. So this is our cheekbones here. Zygomatic bone, maxilla, and then the nasal bones. Now if I rotate this, so I'm looking from at the bottom, obviously you don't have a spring. I hope you don't anyway, attached to the hard palate. But you see the hard palate. Most of the hard palate is the maxillary bones, but here in the back, the smooth part of the bone area is the palatine bones. So that's where we're going to see those, is the palatine bones back there. Okay. There we go. There and there. There are a pair of them right there. So that's your palatine bone. Okie dokies. Now we're going to do this bone, which is the lower jaw. And we'll talk about that. Okay. So let's go back to our list and take a look. We're going to do the mandible, and we're going to do a number of things. We're going to look at the angle of the mandible, and that's where the rami and the body of the mandible meet. Okay. The ramus of the mandible, which is the perpendicular portion of the bone. Okay. The cornoid process, insertion of the temporalis muscle. Okay, so in dark, meaning that we will run into that muscle. We'll learn about that muscle, and that's where it inserts, is right there on the cornoid process. And then the condylar process, which articulates with the mandible at the mandibular fossa, which I believe I forgot to point out. So we'll do that. Okay, that should be in our list. Probably passed it over. All right, so the mandible. Let's take a look at it. It is, the mandibular fossa is part of the temporal bones. Why don't we just deal with that? Yeah. So here's the temporal bone. And there's a fossa right there. And the mandible fits right into that fossa like this. And forms that joint. Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. So let's get a picture, and then we'll come look at the bone itself. And yeah, we'll do this. This is from my friend Mr. Netter. Okay. So, mandible. The angle of the mandible is right here. That is the head, or the condylar process. So we're calling that the condylar process. That's this part. And then this part over here is the cornoid process. The ramus is this perpendicular part. The body is this part. So basically what you get is this kind of construction. You get this and that. And where those two things meet, there's an angle. Okay. And that is referred to as the angle of the mandible, where those two meet like that. The upper part, this part, is the ramus. This part is the body. And then that is the cornoid. And this is the condylar process. So if we take this and look at it now, so body, ramus, angle, condylar process, okay, and then cornoid process, which is this right here. It looks like a shark's fin, okay. And I believe I did include a picture of that. Let's find it. And did I not? Apparently I didn't. I apologize. I thought I did. Oh yeah, I did. I knew I did. There's a couple of ways we can go about this. Let's do it. This is page 5. So page 5. All right, let's go ahead and use some colors. We're going to do this in yellow. We're going to do this in pink. Okay. And then I'm going to kind of create an angle here in green and in blue. All right, and let's start naming them. Okay, so the angle of the mandible the ramus this is the body this portion right there is the coronoid process. And this portion right here is the condylar process. Okay, one last bit of information, and this will come to an end. And we're talking very, very, very briefly on the fetal skull. And the fetal skull has, when we look at the structure of the fetal skull, there are some soft spots between here we go. Some soft spots between the forming bones. So we're going to focus on the anterior fontanelle. The soft spots are referred to as fontanelles. And this closes around 1.5 to 2 years of age. So there are more than one, but we're only going to be, or you're going to only be asked to identify one of those. So here's a series of pictures that will help us. So you can see here is this sphenoidal soft spot or fontanelle, and we have a mastoid fontanelle. So there's a number of them, but the one that we want to focus on is this one right here. This is the anterior fontanelle, and it is forming in the center where the frontal bones and the parietal bones are coming together to create the top of the skull. Notice that the frontal bone begins as two separate bones, but in the adult skull, we only see a single bone. It is one single bone instead of two bones. So let me show you the difference here. So in the adult, this is one single bone, but in its formation, it begins as two bones, just like the parietal bone. But in the front of the skull, these two bones are going to meld themselves together so perfectly that you will never see a suture there, and it will become one single bone, as opposed to the parietal bones where you actually do see a suture separating them from each other and from the frontal bone. But in this case, these come together and form one single bone in the adult skull. But these fontanelles and the spaces that you see in these drawings are designed to allow the skull, number one, to be somewhat pliable as it goes through the birth canal, so that, I mean, the head is the largest part of the baby. It's the most difficult part of the baby to get through during childbirth. And in fact, human skulls are so big relative to the rest of the body, even in a newborn, that childbirth in humans has a higher mortality rate than other mammals because of the difficulties in getting this very large object through the birth canal. But to help that process, we don't weld those bones together. They have this connective tissue holding them together, and so there's some flexibility in the skull. And then, of course, as you grow, your head is going to get bigger, so you have the capacity then to enlarge your brain after you're born, because these bones don't grow together. And then finally, the last of the soft spots, the anterior fontanelle, is going to grow over in around 1.5 to 2 years of age. That's why when you're looking at a young person, like around 2 or 3 years of age, their head seems to be so much larger than their body. And that's because their head is basically done growing. They have the adult head, and the rest of the body has to catch up with it. So that's your fetal skull. We've already talked about the hyoid bone. And do I have a picture of the fetal skull for you? And I think I do. So if we look on page 12, there it is. Let's go ahead and just identify that. That's going to be our anterior fontanelle. Anterior fontanelle. Yeah. By the way, if you look at this picture right here, there's the optic foramen. Nice picture of that. All right. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's the skull. In the next presentation, we're going to do the vertebral column, the ribs, and then that will be it for the axial skeletal system, and we'll move into the appendicular skeletal system. I'll see you then.